Hello and welcome to Business Daily, coming to you live from Seoul. I'm Geun. We have plenty of stories to bring to you this morning. We're seeing mixed projections on the Korean economy from global organizations, the Korean government, and experts here. What's the reason behind it all? And longtime residents who helped build up the vibrant culture of some of Seoul's most popular neighborhoods are being pushed out by sky-high rent. Look forward to these stories and more. But first, let's get a check of day's top business stories. Korea's producer price index continues to sit low, with figures from last month showing no change from March. The Bank of Korea says April's index remained at 101.8, the lowest in over 4 years, and a 3.6% drop compared to the same time last year. The central bank says the low figures are partly due to the plunge in coal and petroleum products, which fell roughly 33% odd year. The producer price index measures the average price change from the seller's point of view and is typically reflected in consumer prices in 1 or 2 months. The number of young people in their 20s and 30s who have no job experience is the highest in 12 years and 3 months. New data from Statistics Korea released on Tuesday show the number of such stood at 95,000 in April, or about 15% of those unemployed in that demographic. While the jobless figures usually dip in the months following February graduation season this year, they swung back up last month. The trend is being attributed to a pullback in hiring in the midst of an unpredictable economic climate. An appeals court in the U.S. has overturned parts of a 2012 patent lawsuit victory that Apple saw against Samsung, reducing the total sum the Korean company has to pay. The Federal Circuit upheld the bulk of the prior verdict, but threw out a finding that would have protected the iPhone's overall aesthetic, saying it would have given Apple a monopoly in improving smartphone functionality. With this, $382 million of the original $930 million sum Samsung owes will have to be recalculated. The court says Samsung still needs to pay damages for other infringements, including for one which protects the shape and color of the iPhone. Being pushed out due to soaring rent prices is not just a reality for households, but also for businesses. And some of these businesses were instrumental in creating a unique culture in particular neighborhoods. Our Eunice Kim has the story.
The Hongdae Art Free Market. Since its launch in 2002, it's become a fixture of Hongdae culture, once a week transforming a playground into a meeting place of independent artists and their customers, surrounded by handmade trinkets, jewelry, caricatures, and live music. But the organization behind the outdoor market had to move its offices out of Hongdae 7 years ago because it just could not keep up with rising rent.
If we were in the business of making money, I suppose it wouldn't have been as big of a deal. But because we're in the cultural sphere, even a small change in rent became a burden we could not bear.
Kim is not alone. A growing number of longtime residents of the region, artists, and small business owners who helped cultivate the vibrant indie culture of the neighborhood surrounding Hongik University are leaving because they could not afford to stay. According to figures from real estate consultant 부동산 114, commercial rental prices near Hongik University rose by 17.2% on quarter in the fourth quarter of last year, one of the areas in Seoul to see rent appreciate at the fastest rate.
Even as of 3 or 4 years ago, this area of Hapjeong and Sangsu was not considered high rent. It's doubled since then.
And the phenomenon is spreading to the theater district of Daehanglo, the traditional Bukchon Hanok village, and beyond, as rapid commercialization is pricing out the very entities that had forged the unique neighborhood identities that draw people in. Eunice Kim, Business Daily.
Now, we're seeing mixed projections on the Korean economy from a number of global institutes to Korean government and experts in the field. What's the current state of the Korean economy and why the different forecasts? Let's find out.
The International Monetary Fund has downgraded its growth outlook for Korea last week, cutting it to 3.1%, down 0.2 percentage points from the previous month. Back in February, it had projected 3.7% growth for the country. Reflecting a different outlook for Korea's economy is the OECD. According to its composite leading indicators, which help track early signs of changes in a country's business cycle, Korea is heading towards robust recovery. The indicators posted a 4-year high in the month of March, following a 9-month rise. Such varied projections are not only seen among major global organizations, but also from within the Korean government and experts here in the country. The Finance Ministry said the economy looks to be on the road to recovery, while the state-run think tank Korea Development Institute believes weak exports are slowing down recovery efforts. Why such mixed projections? And is the country headed towards better performance?
And to tell us more about this, we're now joined by Professor Yang Jun-seok from the Catholic University of Korea. So good to see you here, Professor.
Happy to be here.
All right, so let's start with the IMF. The IMF further downgraded its growth outlook for Korea last week. Why so? And what does it base its projections on?
Well, the IMF has a global economic model. So what they usually do is feed in past numbers, and that model gives you future numbers. It's almost like a computer game. This current projection came after what they call Article 4 consultation. That means a lot of people, specialists, analysts from IMF came to Korea, talked with Korean government officials, Korean experts, and they gotten some on-the-ground information that they may not have had in Washington, D.C. when they calculated these projections last month. So I think part of the problem is that they got some new information which reflects what Korea did in the last 2 quarters. And some of the data weren't that good. And feeding those into the model, it got you a worse result.
All right. Well, what about the OECD data? I mean, it showed that Korea's composite leading indicators hit a near 4-year high. It was rather positive on its outlook. Could you tell us a little bit about the index before we get started, though?
Okay. The IMF used past variables to project future variables, whereas the OECD indicators in this case looks at about 5 or 6 important indicators that they think help predict the future. So here they included things like the KOSPI index for the last few months, the business sentiment indicators, and the interest rate spreads. And those variables actually have been very good in the first quarter. So by the fact that they're looking at different variables, I think that explains a lot of the difference in the projections.
Okay, so I guess that kind of explains why we're getting all these mixed projections from both of the organizations. But other than that, do we have any other reasons as to why one's kind of looking at it in a positive way while the OECD or the IMF is downgrading its growth outlook?
Well, the IMF model usually feeds in the past variables. And as you remember, in the first quarter, all the research organizations in Korea downgraded its projections. And I think the IMF is just getting around to feeding some of those variables in their models. They obviously included some of those variables in the last projection, but they included more of them in this projection because they were here on ground and looking at people who study Korea every day, whereas the analysts in IMF may not necessarily do so. The OECD, well, they look at variables which looks at the future. So something like the business sentiment indicators, they don't necessarily look at what's in the past, but they ask businessmen, what do you feel about the future? And I think it reflects a lot of optimism that some businessmen have in the last few months.
Okay, well, but then even here in Korea, the Korean government has a rather positive outlook on the Korea's economy, while the Korea Development Institute had rather negative outlook on the growth. What's all about that?
Okay, politics and computer modeling. The government has obvious incentives to try to look at the more optimistic picture. And I think that is actually part of government's job because a lot of macroeconomics in the short term depends on consumer sentiment, business sentiment. So it's better for them to play up the positive aspects of the economy. That'll actually help them. Whereas the KDI, well, they also have a model like the IMF. And if you feed in variables which are worse than what they thought or worse than the last quarter, then you'll get a worse result. So I think that explains, it's the same difference between the OECD and the IMF.
The IMF, okay. Well, all things considered, how do you project the economy to do later this year?
Okay, well, both the OECD and the IMF said that it is very difficult to project what's going to happen this year because there's so many mixed signals, not just in Korea, but globally. I think there are definitely positive signs of recovery in certain sectors like real estate, but as a lot of people mentioned, we have a lot of problems in export markets. I think overall we'll do well. But not as well as people hope. There are a lot of positive elements, but I don't think they'll be strong enough to really satisfy the people, but we'll still be less than we want, but still have positive growth.
All right. Okay, we'll definitely have to keep an eye on what really comes next. Thank you so much for coming in today, Professor.
Thank you.
That'll do it for me for now, but I'll be back with more tomorrow at the same time, same place. Until then, goodbye.